Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is Apotheosis on in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Chapter 31, Salas was a liar. Josephine and Leliana did their best to control the rumors that Apotheosis inspired, though I took exception to their definition of control. To downplay the presence of Vius in Skyhold, they allowed it to be said that I'd kept him on as a lover. Combined with the rumors already swirling about my relationship to Dorian, these efforts were entirely successful in deflecting attention from the growing power of my new magic. To my chagrin, it was only because I found myself in the middle of an imagined ménage à trois. Because none of us were Orleans, the story became a rack upon which the nobles could hang their prejudices, against Navarra, against Tevinter, against the elves in general and the Dalish in particular. Apparently it was nothing more depraved than the rumors surrounding any political figure in Orleans, and so 2 of my 3 advisors considered it a rousing success. At least Cullen had the decency to be appalled. As a result, Salas was quickly forgotten at court. Compared to a necrophiliac orgy, there was nothing salacious about a middle-aged elf. They regarded Salas as a kindly, paternal figure, and I think it amused him to play the part. But sometimes, if we were the only 2 mages on the field, he would push into me with his mana as we walked along, his face betraying no hint of what transpired. I would push back, never dropping the conversation at hand, never looking to gauge his reaction. I didn't have to see him to know. Didn't have to touch him to feel. To that extent, being with Salas was remarkably like not being with Salas. He was no less aloof and distant, no more likely to discuss himself, and no easier to reach. He rarely shared my bed at Skyhold or my bunk on the field, but he was with me every night in the Fade. It was his playground, and there was nothing that did not interest him so long as we were there. He'd told Iron Bull such things were childish and beneath him, but, as I quickly learned, Salas was a liar. Chapter 32, Sweet Talker. Her name was Amalia. We didn't meet until a few weeks after the ceremony, but Vius had already cautioned that the process took time. She would require an adjustment period, learning how to navigate the Fade while tethered to the Navarran skull, observing my dreams, taking stock of the world I'd invited her to join. After dinner every night, when Josephine had gone, I'd cast a summoning spell within the skull and wait. It was something of a beacon rather than a command, a signal that could be followed or ignored, and for 2 weeks nothing came of it. Then one night the skull flared as it had during the ritual, soft green light scattering off the Everite. That was the only sign she'd given, but then she came to me a few days later in the Fade. I'd been wandering along Judas Isles crossing in a time before the bridge had been destroyed, and a woman met me along the way, approaching from the side nearer the pools of the sun. She looked no more than 25 or 6, about my age or perhaps a little older. For a human, her amber eyes were large and widely set, adding a rather cat-like quality to her expression. Her hair was long and thick, a heavy mass of copper waves, and she wore a simple linen shift. "Hello," she said with a hardness that reminded me of Cassandra, or maybe it was simply the Navarran accent. "Hello," I returned, pausing in the shadow of a tall statue. "You heard my song?" "I heard a tapping." She smiled, and with her teeth I saw ghosts of Everite and Stormheart jeweled along her skull. "I am glad that you chose me, but the Elgar is not." "The spirit, yes." Cole had actually been very upset with me. I woke up the morning after Vius left to find the wide brim of his hat arcing between the stone owls above my bed. "You're different," he'd said, no sweetness to his voice. "You pull at pieces. They push into place, demons, but different but wrong. I don't like it." Cole will warm up to the idea. Compassion? I had forgotten about that one, as he likes to be forgotten. No, the other. The other. She looked at me darkly, and I felt a tingling in the anchor. "My name is Amalia," she said. "I'm real. No one ever calls you that." My eyes opened and I was back in the Emprise du Lion, a clean step from the Fade to the world. But I must have shifted suddenly, because Salas tightened his arms around me and gently bit the back of my neck in his sleep. It was, without question, my favorite thing about sharing a bed with him. That and the warm expanse of his chest behind me, or the way he'd slip one hand over my mouth when we'd spoon together. "Be quiet, Vihanan," he'd say softly. Salas didn't often join me in my tent, We thought it best to maintain our party's typical bunking arrangements, so I treasured each occasion. Considering that he'd spent the entirety of my life in hermitage, I could appreciate that his taste for solitude was deeply ingrained. It had taken such slowness to win him that I did not want to push. But he never denied me on the occasions that I asked, and the day before I met Amalia had been such a time. Between the eerie glow of red lyrium and its haunting song, as well as the enormous statue of Fenharel lurking in the cave, the high grove camp unsettled me. Not that I said any such thing to Salas, he'd have only observed the irony in fearing an inanimate block of stone while keeping a possessed human skull by my bed. So without any explanation, I simply tugged on the hem of his sleeve when we made camp, and he followed me into my tent before Sira had the chance. I was glad for him now. Amalia had come as a shock. Vyas compared the experience to gaining the friendship of a feral cat. It would take time and trust, and initiative would only ever come from the other side. I could do no more than set out a dish of milk and wait. It had been a thrill to finally meet her, though I suppose I shouldn't have been surprised to find her cryptic and strange. Spirits were like that even under the best of circumstances. I just hadn't expected her to find me so far from Skyhold. This meant I could call on her now, whisper for favors in battle. A shiver ran through me at the thought, and Salas bit my neck again. Enough to hurt, but in a way that felt exciting. I imagined that somewhere in the fade he meant business. I felt his hardness press into me through our breeches. Even with a gentle fire rune beneath us, the emprise was no place to sleep in the nude. I twisted one arm behind me to stroke him through the heavy cloth, felt him swell against my hand. Now he was fully erect, and awake, because he'd taken me by the wrist. No, his voice was sleepy and soft. You started it. I did no such thing. You bit me. Twice. And that, I shimmied my ass against him, had nothing to do with me. Come back to the fade with me, Vihanan. Salas. It is warm and brighter there, we have no need for clothes. Besides, he nuzzled into my neck again, I would prefer to hear your cries. I blushed in the darkness. He always made such a good case for it. I could hardly argue for stealth sex in a frigid tent when he could take me to a time when it was summer in the emprise. Hard to argue for a well-worn bedroll and musty canvas when I could have a verdant grass and a canopy of stars. Arlath Ma, do not deny me in this. Sweet talker. Chapter 33, Sira was never. The rain just wouldn't let up. We were all of us soaked to the bone, wet cloth and leather weighing us down, slowing our steps. Within their fort, the blades of Hessarian had the clear advantage, and their swarm of Maberry left little time for spell casting. Salas and I were using the blades of our staves more so than our magic, and even Sira had a hell of a time finding room to maneuver. It was Blackwell carrying the fight, hunkered down behind his shield and swearing up a storm. I had just enough time to throw lightning into the crowd before jumping back to bring my staff down on a growling Maberry. A wall of ice flew up beside me and a split second later a hail of arrows clinked against the other side. For an instant I saw Salas across the ward pale and panicked on my behalf, but hemmed in by warriors all around. I called the rift above him, satisfied to see it thinning their ranks, but then all was forgotten when a second Maberry lunged at me and I couldn't free my staff from his brother. The hooked blade had lodged between the plates of armor. Of course the gods damned things were armored. It knocked me back, wrenching the staff from my hands as I fell, and the mutt landed on my chest, jaws wide and snarling for an instant before an arrow skewered its throat. A flash of unfamiliar fletching told me it wasn't a rescue from Sira but a Hessarian who'd barely missed. Shit. Arctic winds swirled around me. Salas was trying to slow the dogs and misguide the arrows, but gods, there were so many of both. An arrow pelted me in the thigh, unable to penetrate my mail, but the force of it hard and bruising. Then the world went white as teeth tore into my wrist just below the vambrace. I got off a mind blast, but the Maberry had locked its jaws tight enough to shred as it was blown back. Gods damn it, I could take a giant but would drown in a pack of warhounds. Pain and instinct curled me in on myself, chin to chest to protect my throat, and another dog snapped at the nape of my neck, teeth scraping skull. A single hoarse whisper escaped my lips. Amalia. Deep violet mist rolled out from the earth, from everywhere at once, and weights lifted as the dogs began to howl. The field erupted in sudden chaos, Hessarian archers shooting their own Maberry, warriors ripping their helms off in panic, and the leader of them all screaming bloody murder and clawing out his eyes. I reached for a restoration potion, saw blood and bone at my wrist and lost my grip. Everything turned slow and hazy with Amalia whispering in the back of my mind. You will not fall. Death and dying all around, I've spilled their blood for you. I will feed you. In the fog I could see Sira stalk the edges of battle, well-placed arrows finding exposed throats in the confusion, Blackwool leveling frosted Hessarians, and Salas stepping through the veil. Amalia's healing came over me faster than a potion, a rush of blackness that sprang to light in my veins, skin and muscle crawling back into place and blood singing its way home. Then Salas was at my side, hauling me from the ground to a sitting position, hands on my shoulders to shake me like a child. What were you thinking? Why did you not cast the rift where it was needed? He jabbed his finger at the sky above me, rage hot on his features. Don't know the elfy word for it, but normal people call that saving your arse. His lip curled back at Sira's voice, but he didn't take his eyes from mine, and then I realized, not rage but fear. Finethus, never do that again. His face softened to relief, and Salas kissed me hard on the mouth, tongue sweeping, hands in my hair. I was so caught off guard I couldn't even kiss him back. Though we never tried to hide small touches of affection, he'd never done anything so public before. He helped me to stand, and we made our way through the fort to gather any supplies that would be of value. We hadn't expected a fight at all. I suppose the quartermaster had missed a step in crafting Mercy's crest. We trudged down to the small grove camp, Amalia following behind inside the Hessarian leader's skin, sword drawn and guarding our retreat should any stragglers give chase. It was enthralling to see the brute glide along the path with her preternatural grace, but Sira refused to put her bow away and walked well ahead of us, nervous eyes darting back at every chance. Getting serious about mage stuff. Magic things, she was skepticism incarnate. How about not so much? Just asking. For, not so much magic. Great, yeah. My eyes fluttered shut for a moment, a wordless whisper, and Amalia was gone. Strings cut, the body toppled mid-stride behind us, tumbling head over heels down the slope. Your necro whatever is creepy. Necromancy. Not helping. I don't understand that stuff. It's scary to anyone smart enough to think for a second. You shouldn't be scary. You're the Inquisitor. I'm definitely not scary, remember? I'm the Dalish girl frolicking with Vyas and Dorian. Dorian, Sira. Scary is the least of my defining features in public opinion, you needn't worry about that. Blackwool and Salas had fallen back, each uncomfortable in his own way. You really don't know, she scoffed. Most people are scared. I mean, there's lots of mages here, but most never see one. Never. You're weird. And I know you, so you're not scary, but lots of people don't know you. Rumors and stuff like that give them something else to think about, fun, sexy kinda stuff. Something isn't dead bodies and nightmares and crazy, howling corpses. Realization dawned on me, and I should have seen it before, the rumors were over the top even for Leliana. I shoved Sira as hard as I could, sending her dancing sideways down the slope. Fucking Fenharil, you little ass, it was you. His laughter was a swarm of bees, buzzing, humming, wild. Then I threw a punch, I really shouldn't have, but fucking hell. The rogue dodged it easily, even managed to look genuinely contrite as she caught her footing. I don't want you to be just a scary mage. It was as honest a pout as I'd ever heard. Oh, for fuck's sake, I'm not that scary, I said, shrugging to let lightning dance along my skin. Oh, ha, real funny. Fine. I'm fine with it. Be scary and a shit. Just so we're clear though, that corpse stuff is frigging weird. She shuddered and then carried on a few paces before looking back over her shoulder at Salas. You mad, Elfie? And why should I be mad at you, Sira? 'Cause I told stories on your Lady Inquisitor. I am not the one you have slandered, he refused to take the bait. Interesting. Your interest is not my concern. That's alright, because I meant boring. Then she turned to Blackwool, the elf always takes the elf so that bumping bits will mean something. It was no surprise to me that that particular insinuation snapped him. It is not a topic for discussion. Oh, come on. Drop M and rebuild the empire. She fisted both hands and thrust her hips obscenely, adding an orgasmic roar for good measure. Sira, no more. It came out angrier than I'd intended. Humph. Fine. Whatever. Don't concern yourself, Vihanan, Salas said, his hand coming to rest on the small of my back. She is, apart from herself. I was torn. On the one hand, he'd just called me Vihanan in public and it sounded delicious. On the other, he knew exactly why I was concerning myself with her words. Elf always takes the elf. I could understand why Salas preferred the Fade, our time there had ruined me for other men. And it felt as real there as it would here, so on what grounds could I complain? He'd spent his life as an ascetic, restraint and denial were in his nature. Likely he sought focus and clarity in his magic through self-abnegation, and I tried to understand what it must cost him to indulge even in the Fade. I took a calming breath. I was no less childish than Sira if I boiled it all down to bumping bits, and I was a piss-poor mage if I couldn't see that what Salas offered was transcendent. Chapter 34, Wicked Eyes. When I received an invitation to the Winter Palace from Grand Duke Gaspard, Josephine all but grounded me from my other duties. Where she had previously contented herself with lessons over dinner, the strict timetable of preparing for the masquerade superseded all else. From the moment I woke until I fell into bed, Josephine, Leliana, and Vivian stood at my side. They offered a master class in Orlshian politics, a formal banquet every night for a week so that I could practice my courtly graces. Leliana even pulled Scout Harding from the field for dancing lessons, where I learned to both lead and follow, roles determined by social standing in Orlais. I danced with dignitaries and ambassadors that I scarcely had realized were in Skyhold. I knew with certainty that none had danced with an elf before, much less one of such standing that the game would demand they take a subordinate role. So it was with delicious irony that I found no partner willing to take the lead aside from Vivian. She had not joined the Inquisition to follow. Vivian also arranged portraits of every lord and lady in the Great Hall so that I might recognize them in person, briefing me on their allegiances and peculiarities until they felt more real than the characters in Varric's novel. If someone derided the Marquis de Montsemard, I might suspect hostility toward apostates. Should I meet a friend of the de Lancets, I would find common ground through Hawk. I would do well to know Lord Cyril de Montfort held elven women with disdain, but that Countess Helene fought for our inclusion at the University of Orlais, and Lady Guinevere Volant, now married to a Marcher, had a soft spot for the Dalish. But I didn't need anyone to explain Céline Valmont, nor the woman rumored to have been her lover. There wasn't an elf in Thedas unaware of the Shem Empress who ordered the slaughter of an entire alienage. Regardless of Dalish disdain for our flat-eared cousins, elven blood flowing freely through the streets of Halam Shirel had been an outrage. And from the onset of the Civil War, the Dalish had known of Briola. Her rebellion earned the loyalty of city elves throughout Thedas much as my role as Inquisitor had rallied the Dalish. Truth be told, I had argued to meet Briola rather than be sent to spy on the Conclave, but Deshanna had believed there was time for both. If not for the breach I would have likely carried on to Orlais, but all was forgotten after the anchor. Now that the chance to realize that goal had emerged, I'd never felt so alive. If Salas had taught me anything, it was that an elf needn't wear Valislin to be of the people. If I could prove myself Briola's friend, we might lead our respective factions toward reconciliation for the first time since the fall of Arlathan. So a few nights before the ball, I caught Leliana's eye as we left the war room. "Care to walk with me, Nightingale?" She arched an eyebrow and followed me down to the bailey and beyond the postern gate. As we trudged into the snow, I weighed my options, considered each word, then I laughed. Despite myself a spymaster would require no explanation. Leliana understood the political climate better than I. Either she would see the merit of my plan, or its folly. So I jumped in without preamble, trusting her to understand the whys. I would let the Empress die. Leliana hid her expression in the shadow of her velvet cloak, silent a few moments as she examined the pieces of my puzzle to see how they fit. My, and here Josie thought you might not appreciate the subtleties of the game. I appreciate that so long as Céline sits on the throne, the blood spilled in Halam Shirel cries out for vengeance. The Dalish will give it, Briola's people will give it, and those caught in the middle will lash out on all sides. The reign of this Empress will not see peace again. Chaos for Orlais without Corypheus lifting a finger. Exactly so. She hummed softly to herself and thought. Creators, she wasn't just playing along. She liked the idea. The Grand Duke is no friend of the elves, she cautioned. If an elf were to help him secure the throne, he might make new friends. But even as an enemy, Gaspard could do no worse than Selene. He would have to wage war on the elves directly to outdo the Empress. This is not without risk, Inquisitor. We will need leverage to secure such a position. Perhaps. Vivian speaks highly of the Chevaliers. If I can earn his respect it may not be needed. Regardless of whether it is used, Inquisitor, such information is always needed. Duly noted, I laughed. But I couldn't help but wonder what sort of leverage Leliana might use against me if she believed there was cause. Wondered what circumstances might give her cause. If I hadn't seen the red lyrium-stained world where she gave her life for mine, I would have never learned to trust her. We walked back to Skyhold in silence, Leliana no doubt considering which of her spies she might position to help uncover hidden truths about Gaspard. As we strode into the great hall, Varric looked up from his chair by the hearth. The glint in his eye recognized that we were up to no good, and he tilted his chin in silent greeting. Leliana and I climbed the stairs to the rookery, and while she scribbled a note in haste, I couldn't help but spy on Salas below. He was, as usual, staring at a wall. It was easy to see why the others considered him absent-minded or lost in thought, but he was neither absent nor lost. In such times, Salas withdrew into a meditative trance, one foot in the fade to compress time as in a dream. Such was his focus that he could do it in battle, stealing moments of stillness to restore his mana. I'd never seen anything like it. I tore my gaze away and returned my focus to Leliana, rolling up a slip of parchment to tuck inside a silverite canister at her desk. A soft coo brought a raven down from the rafters and it landed heavily on her arm. Its beak darted forward, nipping at her hair in a way that was oddly affectionate, and she smoothed a finger down its throat in return. Leliana looked to me, indicating that I should hold up my arm. The raven hopped over without any encouragement, the grip of its talons sharp even through my tunic. It rustled its wings to settle, glossy black feathers shimmering with blues and greens as dark as death magic. She secured the canister to the cuff on its leg and then tipped her head to the door behind us, something not quite a smile on her lips. I stepped out onto the parapet, felt a thrill run through me. Somewhere in Orlais, assassins worked to finalize the details of Selene's murder, not knowing their success depended on a Dalish elf who threw a raven into the starless sky. When I turned around, Leliana was standing in the doorway, arms crossed and red hair spilling out from her hood. "You have changed so much," she said. "It suits you." I smiled back. I had changed immeasurably since Haven, but in that moment I had never been more myself, a first is nothing if not a protector of the people. Chapter 35, Interlude. Not that anyone else would notice, but Salas had freckles. The faintest, gentlest smattering over his cheeks, dotting the bridge of his nose, and scattered across each eyelid, flecks of wheat on cream. His eyebrows grew low along the edge of his brow, a tawny shade of chestnut that sent me dreaming of how he must have looked as a young man. There was a little scar on his forehead, almost between his eyes but a little to the left, and another on his chin, cutting through the middle in a way that made it seem cleft. And his ears were perfect, tipping up and curling in just so. When I pulled the soft lobe into my mouth I could feel knots of scar tissue along the outer edge, though I couldn't even imagine him wearing golden rings like Varric. Salas once admitted that he was more than twice my age, and while the truth of it was clear in his action, the reality was somewhere far away. I didn't like to dwell on how that would make him a few years older than my father, though he didn't look at no dark circles or puffs beneath his eyes, no sleepy droop to his gaze. He was the most well-rested man I'd ever met, and I loved to watch him sleep. Even more, I loved to wake him. I kissed the hollow of his cheek, then again at the edge of his mouth. When he didn't move I flicked my tongue between his lips, teasing just at the corner. He shifted beneath me and I trailed the tip of my tongue across his lips, then down to bite his chin. Salas groaned in his sleep, low like a growl, and his fingernails scraped along my back, over the curve of my ass, and to the bare skin of my thighs. And because I was wicked, I arched until I could rest a nipple against the fullness of his lower lip. One hand schemed back up to my hips, my waist, my ribs, to cup my breast as he drew it into his mouth. I couldn't help but moan and lean into it, my hair falling down around us. He put both hands around my ribcage, thumbs hooking each breast, to gently push until I was sitting astride him, veil fire bathing me blue. It is no wonder they tell stories about you, Inquisitor. Stories get it all wrong, I drawled, wondering when exactly he'd woken. As stories always do. I bent down to kiss him, to steal the air from his lungs, to taste him in the flesh, to remember that he was real and not some spirit from the fade. His fingers slid down to tighten around my waist, and he gave one slow roll of his hips in revenge. You're quite drunk. Maybe. Where are your clothes, Vihanan? On fire. I gestured absently behind me, felt warmth across my back as the hideous pile of discarded finery went up in flames. Oh, for. He grunted softly, bucking forward to cast what I assume was frost. I wasn't really paying attention. His chest was bare and warm beneath my fingers, and I was trailing kisses along his clavicle and biting at the fleshier bit near his shoulder. I want to suck you, I breathed. He twitched beneath my hips and I smirked with satisfaction, sliding myself lower. I made it so far as the waistband of his breeches to run my tongue against the flat of the muscle there, but he hauled me back up. As expected. As ever. No. You're the oldest old man I know. That is likely true, he laughed. But you are impossibly drunk, and I will not take advantage of that. You won't take advantage of anything. You're like this very old, very not taking advantage sort of elf. Exactly how much did you drink? Enough for Blackwell's story. About killing puppies. Enough to wanna have you once before you leave me. What? I pressed my forehead against his collarbone, trying to shut out the pain in his whisper, the pain in knowing that he wouldn't argue. You think I don't know, but I know. About my Sylvanwood ring. That's why. To remember me. Now you are talking nonsense. You're trying to hide, but I found you. You have my ring, but you can keep it. He was quiet, rubbing small circles into my back with his thumb. But it was all right. I'd known since I could hardly abandon you now that later was coming. Chapter 36, We all wear masks, my dear. Though we arrived at the chateau of Duke Bastien de Ghislain around midday, Vivian thought we scarcely had time to ready ourselves. When she threw open the vestibule door, it came as a shock to see the sheer number of elven servants lined up to greet us, heads down, ears up, and barefaced under their half-masks. I shrank against Salas, unnerved. I'd never seen so many city elves in one place before. If it bothered him to see our people brought low, he gave no indication, but he rested one hand on the back of my neck, his grip firm to calm me. That particular touch always reminded me of the time he'd saved me, held me down in battle to cast a spell above my head. It had since become his silent signal, I've got you, Vihanan. Colin's armored boots echoed on the marble tile, and we came to a halt by the fountains where Vivian had very nearly killed the Marquis Alphonse on my behalf. Now it was filled with the better part of the Inquisition, road-weary and our day only just begun. The steward stepped forward to greet Madame de Fer before directing a handful of his fellows to trundle off our luggage while another group of servants swept in to settle the lot of us into our quarters. Hand on hip, Vivian spun to face me. My dear, we must depart for the Winter Palace in less than 5 hours, we have not a moment to spare. Just as I have always trusted your handling of the Inquisition, I do hope that you shall now trust me to ensure your success at the masquerade. I'd be barefoot and lost without you, Vivian. Quite. Her eyes almost imperceptibly found and flickered away from the place where Salas had me by the nape. Lucy shall see to your toilette, and, Salas, dear, if you will follow mail, although I dare say there is time to reconsider. Salas withdrew his hand to clasp it with the other behind his back, responding before I had the chance. I can only agree with the Grand Enchanter. Your insistence that I accompany you tonight is ill-advised. Nothing surprised me more than Vivian and Salas working together against me, but there it was, and so it had been for days. While the Grand Duke had extended 7 invitations to the Inquisition, protocol had determined I would need Colin, Leliana, Josephine, and Vivian from the start. That left only 2 others to join me, and I'd chosen Dorian and Salas. No one objected to Dorian, he was noble after all, but everyone considered Salas a strategic mistake, even, and perhaps especially, Salas himself. Without titles or holdings, he could do nothing to bolster my reputation among the lords and ladies at court, and so my invitation seemed wasted on him. Leliana had given me a dark look, and I knew that she understood the symbolism of a Dalish inquisitor with her flat-eared lover would not be lost on Briola. With Salas at my side, she would understand that I had a very real stake in the well-being of all elves. It's not up for discussion. If the veil is thin or corrupted in the Winter Palace, I'll need you. I looked to Salas and then Vivian, but in all else I will defer to your judgment. It was a flimsy excuse, but it would have to do. The fewer people who knew what I intended for Celine, the better. I could see from their expressions they both thought I was a besotted fool, but so be it. I was that too. Very well, my dear, I will hold you to it. In short order, Lucy took me from the hall to the upper apartments, where I let myself be a rag doll, limp and compliant so that whatever must be done could be done in haste. I was dunked in a hot bath and scrubbed as if I couldn't be trusted to do it myself, then toweled and swathed in a dressing gown as 2 more servants arrived. They rubbed lotions into my skin, trimmed and filed and sculpted the nails on my hands and feet, painted each one with Paragon's luster. One woman ruin-dried my hair, then used a heated iron to sculpt it in waves. She braided and twisted and pinned and tied it into something both elegant and wild. And then, because it was not customary for foreigners to wear masks in Orlais, they painted my face. My initial reaction had been so visceral that Lucy took in a sharp breath of surprise, her tiny paintbrush suspended midair. It was like something out of a Dalish nightmare, being surrounded by barefaced women of the people tasked with burying my Valislan in Shemlin tradition. I remembered my promise to Vivian and held myself still, but it was too much. I unfocused my gaze and slipped into the fade, just floating and far away. Eventually I was shaken back to reality in the midst of being corseted and bustled into a gown stained with dragon's blood and trimmed in glittering scales. Madame de Fer would be sure to tell the tale of how I'd slain the beast myself. It was strange to see my body bent into curves, the corset creating cleavage in a waist where I'd had none before. Finally, I was laced into heeled sandals, which I'd been practicing for all week. Lucy held something in her hands and looked at me with trepidation. Yes. For a moment I thought the glittering silverite chains were bracelets, but then I saw the hooks and studs and realized that they were earrings. Fuck Orlais. I took a deep breath. I'd been shot with an arrow before, I could handle this. You'll need someone to pierce me. Apparently, that contingency had already been planned for and Lucy had a roll of fine needles at the ready. I could cast enough cold to dull the sensation, and she made quick work of it. But even the knowledge that it would come undone with a healing potion did little to console me. Elven ears were something of a fetish for the Shemlin, and this was meant to play into that every bit as much as the corset and the makeup. The servants were beside themselves with relief that it had all been done in time and eager for my praise, but in truth I was speechless at the sight of a flat ear in the mirror. I'd become someone else entirely, my face as smooth and featureless as a porcelain doll. The paint covered my Valislan completely, leaving no trace of the sylvanwood branches that crossed my throat, my shoulders, my chest. I stood transfixed and more than a little horrified, completely unaware that Vivian had joined me until a flash of light caught the golden curve of her mask beside me. She put a hand on my shoulder, the compassion in her touch a genuine surprise. We all wear masks, my dear. The Orlesians codify this truth, make it real. They believe that by covering their faces, they can become their truest selves unmasked. The honesty of it broke the spell, and I found myself in the reflection where a stranger had stood before. I remembered the way even a pair of boots once seemed to trouble me. This was a little more complicated, but no different at its core. This was who I needed to be if I were to put Gaspard on the throne. A barefoot Dalish girl would hold no sway at court. Thank you, Vivian. Besides, she continued, not everyone can wear a mask of such ravishing beauty. I laughed, uncertain whether it was flattery or kindness, but indifferent either way. There was nothing beautiful about the barefaced girl in the mirror, but she was ready to play the game. Chapter 37, Wicked Hearts. By the time I'd left my apartments, the rest of the Inquisition had been ferried to the ball. I would travel alone in the Duke de Gislin's personal carriage, a coupe inlaid with hammered silverite, intricately ruined with frost and fire, and pulled by 2 dappled grey horses. Lucy escorted me so far as the gate, where there must have been more than a dozen elven men for my retinue, a coachman, postilion, outriders, footmen, and an honor guard, all in the regalia of House Ghislain. "This has been our privilege, your worship," said Lucy, reminding me that none in Orlais had ever seen an elf hold any power at all. They'd likely never even considered it a possibility. I wanted them to feel proud, not of me, but of the people. We could do so much more than beg for scraps and live in Shemlin shadows. Perhaps when the night was over they would have a reason to believe in something more. I took care making my way down the steps, remembering Vivian's instructions on how to hold my head high and shoulders back, how to let my hips roll forward, how to shift my weight to the balls of my feet, how to keep my fingers curled and twisted in the Orlchian style. If I couldn't carry myself like nobility in private, I'd crumble under public scrutiny. One of the footmen bowed deeply at my approach and offered a gloved hand to help me up the small step into the carriage. Inside were two small benches covered over in quilted velveteen, and I sat gingerly on the very edge. The corseting of my dress made it almost impossible to relax my posture, and the ridiculous cut of it left me feeling as if I might spill out at any moment. And then we were away, a gentle rattle of motion as we sped through the streets of Halam Shirel. I tried to glimpse it through the frosted windows, but the city passed by in a blur. Not that any relics of its elven past would remain, but to actually be in the place where my ancestors had finally put down their burdens. Sooner than I anticipated, the carriage came to a halt and a footman threw open the small door. He proffered a hand to assist, and I took it lightly to balance my weight, not yet trusting myself in heels. I righted myself on the smooth paving stones below, and he swept into a low bow. Josephine stood by the entrance to the palace grounds along with a complement of the Grand Duke's men, and I strode up to meet them. Together we proceeded into the palace gardens, the guard falling into line and saluting as we arrived. "It is a great honor to meet you, Inquisitor Lavalin." Gaspard looked nothing like the Poncy lord in the portraits I'd seen. War had leaned him. Instead of lace and frills all soft in the middle, there stood a well-muscled warrior armed in volcanic aurum. His face and scalp were shaved, but already dark with new growth, and I hadn't expected his voice to sound so rich and smooth. "The rumors coming out of the western approach say you battled an army of demons. Imagine what the Inquisition could accomplish with the full support of the rightful Emperor of Orlais." And which was the rightful one, again? I keep getting them confused. "The handsome, charming one, of course, my lady," he said with a laugh and a bow. I grinned despite myself. Vivian told me that Gaspard detested the game, but certainly it took a measure of skill for any Shem to charm a Dalish. "My lady, are you prepared to shock the court by walking into the grand ball with a hateful usurper?" This was also a joke. The real shock was that elven women were servants and whores, not honored guests of the Grand Duke de Chalons. But masked in makeup and human dress-up clothes, I felt far away from it all, and when he offered his hand I took it. Gaspard tucked my arm through his and drew me to his side. We strolled through the garden, speaking quietly and well aware of the ears around us. Under the ivy trellis of a bay window, we relaxed against a secluded corner of the palace wall. He cleared his throat. "As a friend, perhaps there is a matter you could undertake this evening. This elven woman, Briola. I expect that she intends to disrupt the negotiations. I would very much like consider you my friend, but rest assured that I am the only elven woman that should concern you tonight. I have heard many rumors about your friends, my lady." I twisted against Gaspard to peer up at his mask, and one hand found its way to my waist. Through the hollows of his mask I saw his eyes flicker low, and I reminded myself to thank Cyril later. I leaned in to stroke his fox fur stole. "Then you've heard how such friends enjoy my enthusiastic support." He chuckled softly. "And what sort of man would you consider a friend, Lady Lavalin?" "Let me speak plainly. I care nothing for human politics and even less for the game, but I would call any man that respects my people a true friend. I detest the game, but if we do not play it well, our enemies will make us look like villains. Then I hope we can play well together, my lord. We're keeping the court waiting, Inquisitor. Shall we?" I followed him to the marble steps, and all eyes were upon us as we ascended to the palace door. I was thankful for Lucy's heavy makeup to hide my deep blush. All around, nobles whispered of the elven savage, Gaspard's joke. Yet he looked delighted to be thumbing his nose at the imperial court with a rabbit on his arm, and I held my head high. When we were announced together, he leaned down to laugh in my ear. Did you see their faces? Priceless. We stood at the foot of the stair as the toastmaster announced the remainder of the Inquisition, a neutral smile on my lips as each of them passed me by. Then my spine turned to ice. The Lady Inquisitor's elven servant, Salas. Salas came down the stairs, dressed in the regalia of House Ghislain. He stopped before me and Gaspard, swept into a low bow, and continued on his way. My heart stopped. He'd been my God's damned footman, head downturned so that I couldn't see his face. How had I not felt his magic? How had I not? It wasn't what Leliana and I had discussed, it wasn't what gods. I wasn't breathing. I leaned into Gaspard to still the trembling of my arm. I was shaking with rage. I'd penned the announcement for Salas myself, scholar of the Fate and chief advisor to the Inquisition. My mind was racing, trying to determine who had made the change and why. Some disgruntled lord? Celine? An enemy of Briola? No, it could only have been Salas himself. Or Vivian. No one else could have procured Ghislain's livery or arranged for him to slip in among my retinue. I had no time to think on it. The Grand Duke was leading me up the stairs for my introduction to Celine. We bowed together and exchanged pleasantries by rote, polite turns of phrase that Vivian had taught me a week before. It was exactly the sort of structured conversation I needed to flee my thoughts, and in a blur it was over. Gaspard took his leave, and before I'd even advanced 3 paces, I spotted Leliana leaning against the banister of the upper level. She inclined her head in a subtle signal, then disappeared into the crowd. I took the steps as gracefully as I could, weaving through the nobles to follow her. As I passed a bay window, a hand slipped around my corseted waist and I was dragged into the shadows behind a heavy statue. A wave of mana displaced my magic before I could react, and I felt a scorching heat against my back, needy fingers digging into my hips, breath on my neck. I do adore the heady blend of power, intrigue, danger, and sex that permeates these events. Something hot and wet slid against the sensitive skin of my newly pierced ear. You've been scheming, Vihanan. I tried to twist around to face him, but firm hands held me tight. Finahdes, Salas. He bit at my neck and, truly, I had no resources left for anger or even speech. I melted against him. His lips brushed my ear, words murmured straight into the heart of me so that no one else could hear. You will have far more success seducing the Grand Duke without announcing your lover at court, Delenn. And Briola knows better than most how swiftly those in power will betray the ones they profess to love. I am an asset to you in neither case, and so I have let myself disappear. He was doing the thing he did with Cole, taking tiny pieces and hints of a whole and piecing it all together without ever asking a single question, without ever pausing for clarification, without judgment. His hand slid up to the back of my neck and he held me fast. A pulse of mana surged into me. I watched you from the window, he whispered. You play a very pretty game. Chapter 38, Dance with Me. Perhaps there was a little lace in Scout Harding after all. The elegant steps she'd taught me earned the applause of every noble at court after I danced with the Grand Duchess. But it was Amalia's dancing that earned their fearful respect when I waltzed back in with her corpse an hour later. Whatever other else was said about me, the lords of Orlais would remember that I was first and foremost a mage. When the music stopped and her body dropped to the floor unmasked, Gaspard walked across the ballroom with steely resolve to offer his hand. I'd just killed the Grand Duchess de Chalons and desecrated her corpse. By making such a gesture in full view of the court, he denounced his sister's treason in no uncertain terms. It was also a tacit endorsement of the Inquisition and, perhaps, a sign of goodwill to the elves. He led me to the center of the floor and spun me to face him, one hand on my waist to bring us close together as we waited for the music to start. Gaspard was smiling beneath his mask. The first step was his, driving me back and signaling that he would take the lead. He was the Emperor of Orlais, after all. So I consented to follow, quick steps of retreat to suit his unrelenting press forward. The dance was unfamiliar, but Gaspard's decisive movements left no room for confusion. I let the pull of his arm or the weight of his thigh against mine guide me, the sheer difference in size between us making it easy for him to spin and twist me as he pleased. After the timbre of our negotiations, the sensuality of the dance came as no surprise. but when Gaspard dipped me back to end it with a kiss I was caught totally unawares. It was no more than a chaste symbol of our alliance, to be sure, but I'd never felt human lips on my own or the stubble of a beard, and it caught the breath in my throat. Yet I forced myself to relax in his arms. From Vivian's lessons, I understood that any hint of resistance might be interpreted by the court as a sign of an uneasy alliance. He lifted me back to my feet, and I dropped into another curtsy. "It has been an honor, Inquisitor. Your Imperial Majesty." There were more dances to follow, allowing me to lead with a general and a marquise, as well as endless rounds of toasting to the Emperor, to the Inquisition, to victory against Coryphaeus, to Orlais, and even to the elves. Somewhere along the way, Dorian slipped me a glass of champagne, and I fought the bubbles to down it in a single draught when I tasted that he'd laced it with elfroot and amrita. We were all exhausted from channeling magic without our staves and the physical strain of battle, but I found the emotional toll unusually difficult. I'd killed more than any first should, but without earth to soak up the violence and wind to blow away its stench, death seemed more grisly in the Winter Palace. There were pools of blood on the dance floor, rivers of it trickling down the stairs. Bodies clad in royal sea silk were piled up by the balustrade, dead servants in the galley, and the courtyard fountain ran red from my last strike against Florian. Yet the nobles paid no heed to the crimson soaking the hem of their gowns or the splatter of it on their fine shoes, and the masquerade continued as if the assassination had been no more than an amusing diversion, the slaughter of their peers in the ballroom a mere inconvenience. The Orlesians were sturdier folk than anyone gave them credit for. Sturdier than me, perhaps. I'd thrown off my sandals in battle and my feet were stained with blood, my gown was damp with it. I'd been shot in the shoulder when Florian had trapped us in the courtyard, and though Vivian had been quick with her healing, the mess of it remained. By midnight I was lightheaded despite the restorative potion, or perhaps it was just the restriction of my corset combined with the choking overabundance of lavender perfume. I stole away and slipped out onto the balcony to catch my breath, only to be startled by an immediate voice behind me. "Here at last I find our absent hero, hidden away despite the efforts of all Orlais to find you." It was Lady Morgan, a fair sight less bloody than me. I tensed, unsure of where we stood. Without her assistance, I wouldn't have gained access to the servants' quarters shy of burning down the door, and while she had no reason to suspect that I intended for Céline to die, she might be angry that I'd failed to save her in return. The Empress had provided the mage with safe harbor and prestige. It would not be a stretch to imagine there had been friendship as well. "The elves raise glasses in your honor, even Gaspard drunkenly toasts to a new era, 'tis quite the spectacle." Her voice was light and careless, unaffectedly so, and I tentatively dismissed my concerns. Everyone suddenly wants to talk to the elves. You, at least, I'm glad to see. Then I have happy news, as you shall be seeing a great deal more of me. By imperial decree, I have been named liaison to the Inquisition. Gaspard wishes to offer any and all aid to the one who supported his ascent to the throne. She dipped her head and the black fringe of her hair fell across one eye. Even at rest, her aura seemed wild and elemental, but with a current of something darker that I suspected to be blood magic. We didn't lack for mages at Skyhold, but I had a fondness for apostates. "Welcome to the Inquisition, Morgan." A most gracious response. Unlike the rest of Orlais, she had no taste for idle chatter and took her leave with only a mischievous smirk in parting. I turned my gaze back to the night sky, bracing both hands on the railing. One jump. One quick jump and I could slip into the gardens below to feel grass between my toes instead of blood-slicked marble. That's all I needed. Just a few moments under the stars, with a tree against my back. I peered over the railing, contemplating the distance. If it weren't for the dress, I could manage a clean landing. "I'm not surprised to find you out here." Thoughts. Salas lowered himself to the banister beside me, resting on his elbows and sounding for all the world like a keeper who'd just finished up a lesson. Thoughts. For now, he was not the same man who'd cornered me in the hall. I nearly scrubbed the back of my hand across my face and only just caught myself, remembering the ridiculous Orlesian makeup. I redirected the nervous energy to push myself upright and consider the question. I'd found a man tied naked to a bed, saved a fellow elf from a harlequin assassin, closed a fade rift, let Florian kill the Empress, forged a truce between Briola and Gaspard, danced with the newly minted Emperor, and invited a suspicious mage to join my advisors at Skyhold, all while dressed like a Shemlin princess. Even by Inquisition standards, it had been a very taxing day and the very last thing I wanted to think about. There would be so much thinking about it later. We achieved all our goals. I'm enjoying the moment of peace while it lasts. You should, he laughed. They're fleeting enough. Hang on to them when you can. Salas reached for me then, sliding his hand across my back and surprising me with a curious look. Come, before the band stops playing, dance with me. It was the last thing I'd expected him to say. He pulled back and stepped into a bow, this time heads up, ears up, eyes meeting mine as he offered me his gloved hand. The same hand I'd failed to recognize twice already. He seemed so utterly at ease in his servant's livery, as if it weren't the most insulting costume in the entire world, as if weren't an affront to our people. I twisted away from the edge of the balcony and tried to scowl as if considering his offer, but a smile betrayed me. I'd love to. With all the swagger of a proper lord, Salas drew me into an Orlchian waltz. Something of a change came over him, this regal air that belied his lowly dress. It was in the way he held his head, the grace of his movements, the surety of each step. Where Gaspard had led by force, Salas led as if by right. I felt a wave of satisfaction in knowing that Salas considered himself to have every right. I was his Vihanan. The weight of the day lifted, and for a moment it seemed almost like we were in the fadelight and free. Enchanting music drifted up from the ballroom, candlelight bounced across the balcony, and strange voices in foreign tongues echoed through the distance. At last a muffled round of applause signaled the end of the waltz and Salas swept my arm above my head to spin me round. The whirl of it jangled the unfamiliar silverite on my ears, and suddenly I felt very self-conscious of it. Of it all, the ridiculous fit of my gown and its crushing tightness, the heavy makeup, the hair escaping my knotted crown, the glimmering talons on my fingers, my awkward dance steps and the blood on my bare feet. I involuntarily touched the earring, and it just seemed so real. The piercing, the pretending. Without a word, Salas tugged off his gloves with his teeth and set to work, unfastening the posts and gently pulling loose the hooks of each ring, 6 all told. He let the silverite fall to the floor, discarded the way he'd pluck some piece of lint from my shirt. Then he ferreted out the pins in my hair and was rid of them the same way. His fingers began untangling the mess of it so it fell down around my shoulders as he backed me against the balcony wall. He caught my face in both hands and kissed me, well and truly. No magic, the coolness of his tongue against mine. I pushed back, stretching up on my toes to lean into him. He stood so tall in his boots, I'd never seen him in shoes at all. I scraped my painted nails beneath the tall collar of his jacket to find skin, rolled myself against him. Salas groaned and dropped both hands to my waist where I was cinched so tight that his fingers nearly met along my spine. One hand moved to cup my ass and the other began slowly bunching up my skirts until I could feel the cool night air at my hip. "Little kingmaker," he whispered as his knee nudged my thighs apart. His hand slid down to the back of my knee, pulling to bend and hitch it up around his waist as he rocked against me. He brought my other leg up the same way, and I crossed my ankles behind his back to anchor myself against him. At last I'd gained a bit of leverage and arched high enough to catch the tip of his ear in my mouth. I groaned into the wonderful point of it when he ran his tongue over the tops of my breasts, felt a wisp of worry that he'd taste the makeup that covered the crossing of June's branches in between. I reared back to look down at him, his face buried in the cleavage I'd never had before. He seemed to take perverse pleasure in the Shem costume, and I rubbed his ears between my fingers to pull him closer, feeling twisted up with lust and want despite the strangeness. His hands were busy beneath my thighs and then I heard it, the clink of a belt buckle, and my heart stopped. Was this happening? Gods, here? Another clink of metal on marble and his belt was on the balcony floor. My fingers fumbled at the slippery silk knot of his sash, and he snapped the fine thread of my smalls to pull them right off. He caught me in another kiss, mana surging with it now, and trailed a finger over the edge of my ear. I felt another swell of magic as he healed the damage of Lucy's needle. He held my face in his hands, one thumb stroking my cheekbone and his eyes searching. "You are so beautiful." I smiled down at him and laughed. He'd never said that before. He'd called me a goddess, he'd called me a wonder, he'd called me his mystery, his undoing, his heart, but never that. It seemed crazy, that covered in paint and blood and make believe that he would think to do so now. Arlath Ma, you strange man. Arlath Ma, he echoed. Perhaps I should have expected it, but the moment of tenderness had given him time to still his passion. Salas breathed deeply into my neck to kiss it one last time, rolling the flesh into his mouth to leave a mark. He was fond of that. He pushed at my hips and I unlocked my legs so he could set me gently on my feet. I cannot have you in the fade soon enough, Vihanan. The heat in his voice was enough to make the world seem dull, and I pushed a parting kiss into him with my mana. He'd only just finished with his sash and belt when there was a flash of motion in the corner of my vision. I turned my head in time to see Cullen walk out onto the balcony. He caught sight of us and managed a strangled cough. I was no doubt rumpled enough to look like much more had happened. Oh, ah. Pardon me, Inquisitor. We are set to march. He tilted his head away, eyes averted, cheeks pink. Thank you, Commander, Salas responded smoothly when it was clear the cat had my tongue. Cullen turned on his heel and was gone, and I let out a ragged sigh as I raked my fingers through my hair to tame it into a knot. I readjusted the bodice of my gown where it had been pulled dangerously low, smoothed the layers of my skirt. You're a terrible, terrible man. I know. He snatched his gloves up from the floor and carefully pulled them back on, meticulously tucking the sleeves of his jacket down their length. But for a smudge of pink at his ear and mouth, he looked utterly unbesmirched. I licked my thumb to tidy him, drawing it along his lower lip and wiping at the corners, but when he met my eyes there was something sad about him. I wanted so badly to make that sadness go away, so I stroked his lip with my thumb once more, traced my fingers along the sharp line of his jaw. He offered me his arm, and I took it, once again grateful for the heavy makeup to hide my blush as we moved through the thinning crowd of nobles. Salas wasn't playing the role of my servant now, but my lord, his head high and posture relaxed. I thought, not for the first time, that his mother had named him well. As we strode through the arcade to exit the palace, I caught a glimpse of us in a long mirror and froze, forgetting how nearly alien I looked in the corset and makeup. Salas paused to indulge my wounded vanity as I regarded the strange elf in the mirror. But then I smirked to see an ivy branch of Valislan peeking through at my cheek where he'd rubbed it, a patch of Dalish peeping through the mask. It suits you. What? I turned up to look at him, somewhat confused. The gown, he clarified. You carry yourself like a queen. You're flat-eared queen, I teased, stomping gently on his boot with a bloody toe. He tugged me on down the hall and we'd made it a few paces before the weight of the word sunk in, and I wondered how many Dalish had flung it at him in earnest. Wondered if he'd ever even tried to join a clan before. He'd certainly told enough tales about being driven away from them. Salas, I didn't mean. He pulled me closer as we walked and chuckled under his breath, one hand finding its way to the back of my neck. Chapter 39, Every False Thing. Cullen had concerns about having left Skyhold with so few for its defense and began marching our troops home that night. I would have happily let them make camp in Halam Shirel, but Cullen very nearly insisted and I didn't care to press the issue. He probably though I'd made enough poor decisions for the evening, he'd been aghast that I'd let the Empress die, and gods knew what he thought after finding me with Salas on the balcony. The Duc de Ghislain had extended an invitation for us to stay the night in his chateau and I accepted without reservation. I'd heard of Bastien's poor health before even meeting Vivian, but knew she would not allow herself the luxury of staying if left to her own devices. Not that I had to feign exhaustion to justify myself, I was by no means prepared for the long ride to Skyhold when my fatigue might give her excuse enough to indulge. I was pleasantly surprised to discover she'd arranged for me and Salas to share suite of our own. I half expected her to bunk him in the servants' quarters after their stunt at the palace. That she even acknowledged our relationship felt like an achievement of its own. The quarters were opulent and we arrived to find our armor and staves arranged on a rack, as well as a fire-ruined bath drawn in the adjacent room. Salas led me into the steamy chamber and knelt to unlace my corset. I didn't have the hips to hold it, so when the last row of ribbon had pulled free the gown fell in a pile at my feet. I was absolutely caked in crimson underneath, mostly from the arrow I'd shouldered, but also from a forgotten gash in my side that had been healed at the same time and the remnants of my second dance with the Grand Duchess. Gods, I'd killed a woman and danced with her bloody corpse. I'd been so high from the battle, it didn't seem. I can't I sprang away from where he crouched by the tub, twisting to put my back against the wall. What? I can't do this. I can't get in that thing and soak in Floriane's blood. I fumbled with the latch at the tall window and pushed it open. There was only a short drop to the ground, no higher than the front stairs of Skyhold. Salas narrowed his eyes in confusion. What are you doing? I have to wash this away, I gestured vaguely to myself. We passed that little creek just down the way and... You can't be serious. I laughed. Dirth Ma, do you think I'd ever had a bath before Haven? I can't pretend that sitting in a fancy bucket of filth is normal, Salas, not today. Ma Nuvanin, he said, picking up his discarded jacket. No, no. Stay, please. I won't be gone long. Enjoy the bath. They took the time to draw it. They. The elven servants. Alive, but all those elves in the palace. You shouldn't go by yourself, Delenn. Come if you'll bathe too, but Isala Malath Din Haran. I jumped, not waiting to see if he would follow. It did not surprise me that by the time I'd picked my way to the creek I was still alone. Salas had not undressed for me since the night at the hot spring, and though I'd seen his nakedness countless times in the Fade, I could never get over the strangeness of how he eluded me in the waking world. Things have always been easier for me in the Fade, he'd said. Soon I found a defensible stretch of the creek where I could bathe in the shelter of a rocky outcropping, and I cast wards in 3 directions to be safe. A fire rune upstream knocked off the chill, and I crouched with my back to the craggy wall. The stream was shallow but fast, and that's all that mattered. I scrubbed my hands and feet with a fistful of pebbles and the darkness was a mercy. Surely the water ran red. All those dead elves, a whole city of dead elves, a whole history of dead elves. Mythal, please help Bryala do something good with this. Please let the Dalish see reason. Please. It took a good deal of mud and silt to scrub the oily slickness of the makeup from my face and neck, but when I could see the Valislan at my breast once more I was at peace. I rinsed my mouth and spat out the taste of champagne and elfroot, then banished the wards in parting. Whatever Dorian might suspect, the Dalish didn't often run naked through the moonlight, though it was certainly not an unfamiliar feeling. I didn't exactly have moonlight at my back, there was a blush of dawn on the horizon, but it felt marvelous to fly across the field back to the Chateau bare under the open sky and free from every false thing, no costumes, no pretending, no inquisition, no game, no potions for feigned strength. Just my own power and my own skin. By the time I made it back to the chateau I'd set myself right, exhausted, but whole. It was easy enough to scramble up to the window thanks to the many footholds in the brickwork, and Salas had not closed the window. The tub had been drained, and I smiled to know it had not been wasted when my foot found a damp towel on the floor. Even in the darkness, I could see a few of the bottles on the toilet had been moved as well. Salas loved that sort of things, scented oils and perfumed water. Whether the handsome leather belt that he wore or the buttery crumb of a rose-scented cake, he had an appreciation for craftsmanship of any kind. When I once derided the expense of a rug brought to my room in Skyhold, he'd taken me to the memory of a village in the Fade where that very rug had been made. The nobility sustained their entire way of life, and the villagers wove their own history into each rug. I stopped in the doorway to lean against the frame. Salas was kneeling on just such a rug in the center of the bedroom, head bowed, eyes open but unseeing. A flame burned in his palm, the only light in the darkness, and he wore 2 thin obsidian chains around each wrist and threaded through his slender fingers. I knew them to be enchanted, but to what end I could not discern. Whenever I saw him like that, I felt the years between us. His magic was old. I might have an edge on him in battle, I had a deeper arsenal of offensive and debilitating spells, but there was no question that he was the more powerful mage. He'd simply invested his skill set elsewhere, delving into the mysteries of the Fade in his own inner world, in the truest sense a mystic. The room thrummed with his magic, caressing my skin. He knew that I'd come back, the anchor bled too much magic for any mage to ignore. His head tipped up and the Fade fled the gray of his eyes. The fire died in his palm exactly as candles in the room sprang to life. He flexed his fingers to shrug off the chains, pocketing them in the folds of his robe as he stood. Do you miss your clan? The question caught me off guard. Salas very rarely asked anything about my past, but then again, I didn't often run out into the night in a fit of Dalish panic. I smiled to reassure him that I was not at my wit's end. Yes, of course. Will you return to them when this is over? This question surprised me even more. We had only ever discussed the future in terms of Corypheus and his defeat. Cassandra had asked me the same thing once before, but with Salas I couldn't hide the truth behind the Inquisition. I was never meant to return. For once, I had completely surprised him. He joined me at the door, sliding his hands around my bare hips and peering down with the most dreadful curiosity spreading over his features. My little sister is a mage, I offered, and his eyes narrowed sharply. Your keeper would turn her out. Not the way some would, not like Minov. Her keeper, I bit my lip. Her keeper was a coward. Magic is not so common among the Dalish that any clan can afford to hoard or squander it. Minov would have been a blessing somewhere. At any rate, Hannah is young enough to train up a new first, and I laughed to divert him. This conversation would not end well. Come to bed with me, Salas. I slid my fingers into the waistband of his breeches, letting my knuckles graze along the smooth skin below his navel. I fisted the linen and took a step back, forcing him to either follow or allow me to tug open his breeches. He pushed me forward, toppling me into the bed to pin me beneath his weight. With a twist, he wound the coverlet around us like a cocoon and all but dragged me into the fade. Chapter 40, Unwashed Apostate Hobo. I woke wrapped in the warmth of him, sunlight streaming through windows. It was nearly midday, and we hadn't moved an inch since falling into bed, still perfectly twirled up in the heavy blanket. I never slept so well as when I slept with him, the way he held me so damn close, cradled to his chest and legs hooked around me. Sometimes, when I didn't make a clean step from the fade, I'd think for a moment I was still with my clan, piled up in an arrival with my lethalin back before the world had come undone. I wouldn't be going back but, perhaps, going forward wasn't so far-fetched. It was silly to read too much in the simple questions he'd asked the night before, but Salas was a man of so few words that I couldn't quite help myself. I crushed the idea down into something manageable, something forgettable. So long as the threat of Corypheus remained, my future could take the shape of red lyrium and a Salas who would die to save me. How can you already be so lost in thought, Vihanan? That bad? I huffed a little breath of surprise. I was in Redcliffe. His fingers ran along my spine and, slowly, he sank the fullness of his mana into mine. Where are you now? Right here, I whispered. His mana flickered back, a kiss and nothing more. Shall we be about our day? We took the time to do a few of our morning meditations, a quick run-through of staff work to bring our auras into balance and ensure a strong connection between our mana pools and staves. I'd been in practice since my receiving my first staff as a child, but Salas had shown me ways bring more focus into each pose, simplifying the exercise considerably. By the time we'd dressed and made our way downstairs, a luncheon had been arranged on a wide banquette in the parlor. Vivian was reclined on a divan, holding a saucer in one hand and a teacup in the other, 3 fingers carefully curled around the handle and the smallest 2 elegantly extended. Dorian was taking tea as well. They had clearly moved on from lunch, laughing about a dance with some handsome marquis the night before. Good afternoon, my dears, are you much recovered from the ball? I do hope you'll have something to eat. I made a plate for myself, happy for bread and butter and slices of persimmon instead of the cold turines and flaky tarts that seemed to pique Salas' interest. I sat on the edge of a chair next to Vivian, balancing my plate on my knees, and in a moment Salas joined Dorian on the low couch. Salas, you startled me, you're so nondescript. Dorian gave Salas a once-over as if wearing a wolf pelt was so last season. Please speak up, I cannot hear you over your outfit. I knew from the game that laughing spoiled the joke, but I couldn't help myself. Salas was more clever and quick than anyone gave him credit for, and his deadpan delivery made it all the more delicious. Dorian glanced at me, amused that I was amused, then followed my gaze back to Salas before shaking his head as if I were a lost cause. Emboldened, he carried on with his banter. Salas, what's this whole look of yours about? I'm sorry, he said before carefully biting into a cheese tart. No, that outfit is sorry. What are you supposed to be, some kind of woodsman? Is this a Dalish thing? Don't you dislike the Dalish? Here he paused to wink at me, or is it some kind of statement? No. Well, it says apostate hobo to me. Unwashed apostate hobo, more specifically. Vivian added, her empty teacup and saucer hitting the table with a soft clink. The Dalish would call it a statement, I said dryly, giving Salas a half-hearted glare. Oh, how so? Dorian looked intrigued. That particular sort of fur is somewhat sacrilegious. Perhaps you have not noticed, Vihanan, but I am not Dalish. Have I complained? Let me get this straight, Salas, Dorian interjected. You're an apostate, neither Dalish nor city elf, who lived alone in the woods, studying spirits. Is that a problem for you? No, you're a special and unique snowflake, live the dream. Speaking of dreams, darling, you were a vision last night. Brava. Vivian gave me a sly smile as a servant appeared to refill her tea. I tried not to stare, as if having an elf weight on one hand and foot was perfectly normal. Only thanks to you, Madame de Fur, though I'm afraid the dress was completely ruined. Oh, well, that's fine, my dear. We would have burned it anyway, the Inquisitor mustn't recycle her fashions. I did burn it, said Salas, picking up the napkin on his knee to dab his mouth. My, Dorian raised an eyebrow. The flames of love. Did you really burn it? Salas looked at me, quite sincere. I did not think you would want to see it again. That was true, I thought, returning to my bread and butter. I hadn't even noticed that it was gone when I'd returned from the creek, nor again in the morning. He'd made the bloody mess disappear as if it had only been a bad dream. I gently pushed at him with my mana, careful to channel in a way that neither Vivian nor Dorian would notice. A smile ghosted at the corner of his mouth. We set out for Skyhold within the hour, the sun at our backs. Though I still hadn't sorted out my feelings about Halam Shirel in general, it was our conversation over tea that lingered with me on the road. The apostate hobo jokes that Dorian and Vivian leveled at Salas were not without teeth, and they forgot the same and more could be said of me. The Dalish were by definition homeless. At least Salas had been born in a village. I'd never taken a bath nor worn shoes until Haven. If not for months of Josephine's diligent tutoring in human etiquette and custom, a week spent preparing me for Halam Shirel would have done little good. There were just too many details to remember for one not born to that life, which was to say I understood the kind of effort it took to pretend, as well as the ways in which I could never hide. I gave myself away whenever I laughed, open-mouthed, and too loud for small rooms because I was only ever used to open air. I gave myself away whenever I spoke, mispronouncing certain words and none the wiser because I'd learned them from books and not a Shemlin teacher. Whenever I slouched, whenever I kissed the wrong hand, whenever I bowed too low, or not low enough, however well I played the game in 1,000 tiny ways any noble could see that I did not belong. It was only thanks to Josephine's monumental efforts that I did not trip in Winter Palace to reveal my true self, an unwashed apostate hobo. So while Salas paid no mind to our party's banter, I found their jabs too sharp, increasingly so as our journey wore on. It was fascinating to observe you at the Winter Palace, Enchanter. I am pleased that such engagements were enjoyable for everyone. Even those with no grasp of subtler social interplay might enjoy the pageantry. It is all pageantry, Enchanter, Salas said with false wisdom, as if he disdained rather than facilitated such things. I do hope you were not mistaken for a servant at the Winter Palace, Salas. A wicked edge of laughter ran through her words. Such mistakes are opportunities in disguise. Nobles say things around servants they would never say to Cassandra, or the Inquisitor. Yes, anyone who wishes to play the game learns to use her servants effectively, although I am surprised to see an elven apostate catch on so quickly. My apologies, I shall try to live down to your expectations. 1,000 angry retorts burned on my tongue, but I remained in awestruck silence. In a few simple words Salas had goaded Vivian into disclosing her true opinion of me, outplaying her so masterfully that she had no idea anything had happened at all. I felt a brush of magic against my skin and knew then that it had been a gift. He was showing me something of the enchanter that I had not seen before. In her world, elves could do no more than aspire to serve as well-trained pawns for masters of the game. At the masquerade, I'd been only a different sort of servant to use in a different sort of way. That the elf she had ordered painted and pierced failed to save Celine was no more than a stroke of bad luck. Vivian could simply not conceive that an elven apostate had intentionally put Gaspard on the throne. If I'd had any illusions about her friendship before, I certainly held them no longer. The knowledge sat sour on my stomach. Check the description for the links to the author.